There is a night in October 1962 that music history has never quite examined with the attention it deserves. Four young men from Liverpool, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, stood in the wings of a theater in the north of England and watched a performer from Macon, Georgia take a stage and do something to an audience that they had never seen done in quite that way before. They had heard his records. They had played his songs in the clubs and dance halls where they had spent their formative years learning what music could be. They had studied him the way serious students study the people who know things they need to know. But hearing the records and watching the man perform were, it turned out, two entirely different experiences, and what they saw that night in the wings, the specific, physical, total reality of Little Richard on a stage, was something that none of them would ever entirely stop seeing. The Beatles became the most successful musical act in human history. They changed popular music more completely and more permanently than almost any other force of the 20th century. They did this through a combination of gifts so extraordinary that it still resists full explanation: melodic instinct, harmonic sophistication, lyrical intelligence, performance presence, cultural timing, and the specific chemistry of four particular personalities in a particular configuration at a particular moment in history. But gifts do not exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by what they encounter. They are formed by the music that comes before them, by the performers they witness, by the demonstrations they receive of what is possible and how far the possible can be pushed. And among the demonstrations that shaped the Beatles, among the specific, irreplaceable encounters that helped form what they would become, the months they spent as Little Richard's opening act in 1962 occupy a place that is more significant than the history books have always acknowledged. This is the story of what four young men from Liverpool saw when they stood in the wings and watched Little Richard perform. It is the story of what they learned, not from his records, which they already knew, but from his presence, which was something else entirely. And it is the story of what Little Richard saw when he looked at the four young men who would one day be the most famous musicians on earth, and what he understood about them before the world had any idea who they were. But first, you have to understand where both parties were in 1962, because the encounter only makes full sense when you understand what each of them was carrying into it. Little Richard in 1962 was not the commercial juggernaut he had been in 1956 and 1957, the years since his departure from rock and roll, the theology school, the gospel recordings. The deliberate withdrawal from the secular music world had cost him commercial momentum that was not easily recovered. The British invasion had not yet happened. The cultural landscape of popular music was in a period of transition, the initial explosion of rock and roll having somewhat settled into a more managed and less volatile form. The artists who had driven that explosion, Richard among them, were navigating the complicated question of what came next. He was performing. He had returned to secular stages after the years of gospel focus, compelled back toward the music by the same force that had always compelled him. The impossibility of remaining away from it for long without something essential beginning to diminish. But the shows were not the massive commercial events of his late 1950s peak. He was working the circuit rebuilding, performing in venues that ranged from significant to modest, touring in contexts that included opening acts who were themselves at various stages of their own development. One of those opening acts in late 1962 was a group called the Beatles. The Beatles in October 1962 were on the verge of something, but the verge from the inside does not always feel like a verge. It feels like continued effort, continued uncertainty, the same grinding daily labor of attempting to build something in an industry that offers no guarantees. They had released their first single, Love Me Do, in early October 1962. It had entered the British charts but had not yet produced the kind of response that would make the future legible. They were a promising group with a devoted regional following and a professional hunger that everyone who encountered them could feel, but they were not yet the Beatles in the way the world would come to understand that phrase. They had been playing together in various configurations since the late 1950s. In Liverpool, in the clubs of Hamburg where they had served the kind of extended, intensive performing apprenticeship that builds certain muscles no other training can build, in the venues of northwest England where they had developed from a local curiosity into a regional phenomenon. They had absorbed an enormous amount of music across those years. American rock and roll, rhythm and blues, country, skiffle, the full range of what was audible to young musicians in Britain in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And among the American artists they had absorbed most deeply, most completely, with the most devoted attention, was Little Richard. John Lennon had imitated Little Richard's vocal style from an early age. The falsetto, the specific quality of attack on a note, the way the voice could move from one register to another with a speed and conviction that felt less like technique and more like necessity. Paul McCartney had studied his piano playing, his performance energy, the way he commanded a room with his whole body rather than just his voice. Long Tall Sally, Tutti Frutti, Good Golly Miss Molly, Lucille, in their sets for years, using them as vehicles for demonstrating what they could do to a crowd when fully committed. Little Richard's music had been part of their formation in the most fundamental sense. It had been present while they were becoming what they were going to be, but they had not seen him perform live. Not yet. And that distinction, between knowing the records and witnessing the man, would turn out to matter in ways they had not anticipated. The tour that brought Little Richard and the Beatles together in the autumn of 1962 was a British package tour, the kind of multi-act touring arrangement that was common in that era, several performers sharing a bill and traveling together, each playing a set before the headliner took the stage. Little Richard was the headliner. The Beatles were among the supporting acts. The arrangement was straightforward. They would open for him, he would close the show, and the audiences who had come primarily to see Little Richard would have the incidental experience of watching four young men from Liverpool perform before the main event. The first night of any such arrangement produces a specific kind of assessment. The headliner and the supporting acts take each other's measure, observing performances, calibrating expectations, forming impressions that will either be confirmed or revised as the tour progresses. Little Richard watched the Beatles perform from the wings on the first night, and what he saw was something that his extensive experience with young touring musicians had not quite prepared him for. They were extraordinary, not in the polished, finished way that an established act is extraordinary. Their rough edges were still visible, their youth was present in certain aspects of the performance. The absolute peak of what they would become was not yet fully manifest. But there was something in the room when they played that was different from what most supporting acts produced. The audience responded to them with an intensity that exceeded what a supporting act typically generates. There was a quality of connection between the four of them and the people watching that had the specific texture of something real rather than something performed. Little Richard recognized this immediately. He had spent his entire career reading rooms, understanding, in real time, what was happening between a performer and an audience, what the energy in the room was doing and why. What he read in the room when the Beatles performed was not the ordinary enthusiasm of an audience being entertained. It was something closer to the beginning of a surrender, the specific quality of attention that an audience gives when it has encountered something it has not encountered before and does not yet have a framework for. He watched them carefully. He asked questions about where they had come from, how long they had been together, what they were trying to do. He spoke with Lennon and McCartney backstage in the way that experienced performers sometimes speak with younger ones they have identified as serious, not condescending, not performing generosity, but genuinely engaged with the specific questions of what they were building and how. And what he heard from them in those backstage conversations was something he recognized. He heard people who had been formed by the same music that had formed him, who had absorbed his own records and the records of the other rhythm and blues and rock and roll artists who had built the language they were all now speaking. He heard people who understood, at a fundamental level, what music was for and what a performance was supposed to do to a room. He heard, in their questions and their enthusiasms and their specific references and their way of talking about the music they loved, the unmistakable sound of people who were not simply talented but genuinely, irreversibly devoted to something. He told them, in his direct, unmodulated way, that they were going to be enormous. He said it with the specific authority of someone who had read enough rooms to trust his reading. He said it before it was obvious, before Love Me Do had climbed the charts, before any of the machinery of what would become Beatlemania had begun to engage. They remembered that he said it. They talked about it in interviews for decades afterward. Then the Beatles watched Little Richard perform. And this was the experience that completed something in their understanding of what they were trying to do. They had known his records for years. They had played his songs. They had imitated his vocal style and studied his energy and used his music as a vehicle for their own development. But watching him perform live, from the wings, in real time, with the full physical reality of it available to them rather than the compressed, mediated reality of a recording, was a different kind of education. What they saw was a man who inhabited a stage with a completeness that had no precedent in their direct experience. They had seen good performers. They had been in rooms with talented people who knew how to hold an audience and how to build energy and how to make a show work. But Little Richard on a stage was categorically different from all of that. It was not a matter of degree, more talented, more energetic, more skilled. It was a matter of kind. He was not performing at the audience. He was performing with them, in a relationship of genuine exchange that the audience was fully inside rather than watching from outside. The energy moved in both directions simultaneously from him to them and from them back to him, building in a loop that had no natural ceiling, because each party was responding to the other's response, and the whole thing kept escalating. The crowd did not simply applaud or cheer or indicate approval. They transformed. Something in the room became different from what it had been before he took the stage, and the difference was visible and audible and felt in the body in a way that passive entertainment never produces. John Lennon watched this from the wings with an expression that people who were present described as total absorption. A man receiving information through every available channel simultaneously, storing it, processing it, understanding things about performance that he had not understood before. Paul McCartney watched with the same quality of attention, the same almost alarming focus of someone who has recognized that what they are seeing is important and cannot afford to miss any of it. What they were watching, specifically, the thing that completed something in their understanding, was the demonstration of what it looked like when a performer stopped managing the relationship with the audience and simply entered it. When the gap between the performer and the people watching collapsed entirely. When the stage ceased to be a platform for displaying something and became instead a shared space where something was happening to everyone in the room simultaneously. This was not a technique that could be learned from a recording. It was not available in the 3 minutes of a single. It lived in the specific, physical, real-time reality of a performer fully present in a room, and it could only be witnessed, not reproduced from a distance. You had to be there. You had to watch it happen. And once you had watched it happen, once you had seen it in your own body's presence, felt the room change around you as it occurred, you could not unhave that knowledge. It became part of what you knew performance could be. Lennon and McCartney and Harrison and Starr all had that knowledge after the first night they watched Little Richard perform from the wings. It went into them and became part of the foundation of what they were building. It informed, not directly, not in any one-to-one correspondence that could be traced, but fundamentally and permanently, what they were reaching for when they themselves performed, the specific quality of presence that the Beatles would bring to their own live performances, the relationship with an audience that produced Beatlemania, the specific kind of collective surrender that their concerts generated, was reaching for the same thing that Little Richard demonstrated in those wings. Not imitating it, not reproducing it, but reaching toward the same understanding of what a performer could do to a room when everything was fully committed. The backstage conversations during that tour have been described by multiple participants, and they share certain consistent elements. Little Richard was generous with his time and his knowledge in ways that surprised people who expected a star to maintain a more careful distance from supporting acts. He talked about the music with the same directness and lack of performance that characterized his public commentary on most things, saying what he actually thought rather than what seemed strategically appropriate. He told Lennon and McCartney things about performing that they had not been told before. Not technique in the narrow sense. They had their own techniques, well developed by years of Hamburg and Liverpool, but larger things. About what the relationship with an audience was supposed to feel like, about the difference between giving a performance and entering an experience, about what it meant to be fully responsible for a room, to understand that when you took a stage, every person in that building had placed some portion of their evening, their attention, their emotional availability in your hands, and that the only honest response to that trust was to give back something that was entirely real. He talked about gospel, about the church he had come from and the specific understanding of music that the church had given him. The understanding that sound could move through a room and change what was in people, could reach past the surface of ordinary consciousness and touch something underneath. This was not metaphor for Richard. It was a description of what he experienced when performance was working fully, and he described it with the directness of someone reporting on an observable phenomenon rather than constructing a romantic narrative. McCartney listened to this and later said, in various interviews, in various forms, that what Richard described matched something he himself had begun to feel in certain performances, moments when something happened between the band and the audience that exceeded what any of the participants had put in and became something none of them entirely controlled. Richard gave him a framework for understanding those moments, a vocabulary that came from gospel and from 60 years of American black musical tradition, and that the young man from Liverpool had been reaching toward without having the language for. The tour ended. The Beatles went back to their own trajectory, the one that would take them, within the following year, to a level of fame that the world had not previously produced in quite that form. Little Richard continued his own, rebuilding his commercial presence, navigating the complicated terrain of a career that had been interrupted and restarted and interrupted again by the ongoing conflict between his faith and his music. They did not forget each other. This is documented. The Beatles spoke about Little Richard in interviews throughout the 1960s, not always at length, not always in terms that fully captured the depth of the debt, but consistently. They named him. They credited him. They said, in public and on the record, that he had been foundational to what they were doing. Paul McCartney performed Long Tall Sally with a vocal intensity that was clearly reaching for something he had first seen demonstrated in person from the wings of a Northern English theater. John Lennon's screaming vocal approach, the specific quality of release and abandon in his most committed performances, owed something to watching a man from Macon, Georgia show him what total vocal commitment looked like when it was fully inhabited rather than approximated. And Little Richard, for his part, spoke about them, about the four young men he had watched from the other direction, who had opened for him before the world knew who they were, and in whom he had recognized something immediately and said so. He had seen what they were before it was legible. He had been, in that specific and irreplaceable sense, the first person outside their own circle to say this is real, and it is going to be enormous. The question of what each party gave the other during those autumn months of 1962 is not simple and does not reduce to a clean accounting. Influence between artists rarely does. What Little Richard gave the Beatles was not a lesson that could be written down or a technique that could be transferred intact. What he gave them was the living proof, experienced in the body rather than understood in the mind, that the thing they were reaching for was reachable, that the relationship with an audience that they were trying to build, the specific quality of presence and connection that they could feel in their best performances, but could not yet sustain or fully understand, was something that could be achieved, something that a human being could actually do in an actual room with actual people. He had done it in front of them. They had watched it happen. And that watching was a form of education that no amount of listening to records could have provided. What the Beatles gave Little Richard was different but also real. They gave him, in those backstage conversations, the evidence of his own reach, proof that the music he had made and the performances he had given had traveled further than he could always see from where he stood, that young men in Liverpool had grown up with his records and been formed by them, and were now standing in front of him with the specific intensity of people who understood exactly what they owed and wanted to understand it more fully, that the chain of transmission he had been part of, the chain that ran from the Pentecostal churches of Macon through the recording studios of New Orleans and outward into the world, had reached places and people that he had not known to imagine. There is a moment, in the accounting of any creative life, when you understand that what you made has become independent of you, that it exists in the world in ways that exceed your knowledge of it, that it has reached people you have never met and changed things you cannot see. That moment is not always comfortable, it is not always legible. But it is, when it arrives, a form of confirmation that no award or chart position quite replicates. Little Richard had that moment in various forms across his long life, but one of the earliest and most specific versions of it happened in the autumn of 1962, in the backstage corridors of theaters in the north of England, when four young men from Liverpool showed him, in the specificity of their knowledge and their questions, and their barely concealed reverence, exactly how far the music had traveled and what it had done when it arrived. He had changed them before he met them, and meeting them confirmed it. The Beatles opened for Little Richard. They stood in the wings and watched him perform and learned something that completed their understanding of what they were trying to do. They went on to become the most famous musicians in the history of popular music, and in interview after interview across the decades they named him the man who had shown them, before anyone else, what it looked like when a performer gave everything. And Little Richard, the man who had always known what he carried, who had fought for decades to have that knowledge acknowledged, had the specific satisfaction of watching it confirmed in the most dramatic possible way. The young men he had recognized, before the world could see them clearly, had gone on to demonstrate to the entire planet that his recognition had been accurate. He had seen them first, he had said so. And he had been right. The teacher and the students, the source and the river, the man who built the foundation and the men who built upon it something that changed the world. The music moves forward, it always moves forward, and at the beginning of the chain, always, at the beginning of the chain, is the boy from Macon who stood at a piano and showed everyone who came after him what it looked like when a human being refused to be anything less than entirely, completely, irreversibly themselves. The Beatles never forgot what they saw, neither should we.